Hey, CNFers, you know this show takes a lot of time and effort, and part of what keeps the lights on here at CNF Pod HQ is if you hire me to perhaps edit your work or bring you along. A generous editor helps you see what you can't see. I know I can't see myriad things in my own work, so I outsource those eyeballs to somebody else. This could be a pitch, a proposal, an essay, or hell, even a book. If you want help cracking the code, you can email me at creativenonfictionpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll start a dialogue.
But when we were in the car, it was a little crazy. I had a steno pad that I kept on my knee, and then when I'd hit a red light, I would just write as fast as I could whatever it was that we'd said in the intervening 4 or 5 blocks, and then I put it down, put the car in gear, and move forward.
Oh, would you believe it? We have Darcy Frey on the podcast this week to talk about his masterpiece, The Last Shot, City Streets, Basketball Dreams. Print version of the book, published by Mariner Books, but it's got a new audiobook performed to perfection by J.D. Jackson for Spiegel and Grau. We'll get to that in a moment. But on the heels of being called a, quote, cheesy shock jock high-energy D-bag a week ago, we have a new review. This is a 5-star banger. If you leave a written review, I'll read it right here and give you a coaching session of up to 2,000 words. So email me with a screenshot of your review and we'll start a dialogue. So this one from Sorry Surrealist. Well-prepared and earnest host. There is one thing I can't stand in interview-based podcasts, and that's unpreparedness. Brendan is most definitely prepared, and that makes all the difference. I listen to one other writing podcast, and every time I do, I find myself wishing Brendan were the host. It's incredibly frustrating. In some ways, sure, he can be cheesy. There's that word. But I think the difference between a shock jock and this man is that Brendan is sincere and never, ever malicious. I like that he's true to himself and that he's honest, too. His transparency is charming, though he can be an acquired taste, which he admits. Give the podcast a try. The guests are well curated. Brendan lets them talk, a talent some hosts don't have. And he's always ready to bring the interview back on the rails when needed. That is awesome. Thank you so much, Sorry Surrealist. Yes. Again, thank you for that. Show notes and the parting shot of this episode and more are at brendanamara.com. Hey, where you can also sign up for the companion Rage Against the Algorithm newsletter. Each podcast gets a cute little newsletter now, since I'm not really on social media anymore. There's a Too Long Didn't Listen mini transcript from the podcast, from that week's podcast. Some behind-the-scenes bullshit about my rotten head and my even more rotten writing. Then there's the first of the month Rager with cool links, book recommendations. It literally goes up to 11. There's also patreon.com/CNFpod. And if you want to support the show with a few dollar bills, and maybe even get some face-to-face time with me to talk some things out, it helps. I've been told it helps. It's an option if you want it. Some of you CNF and patrons are just happy to support the show, which is awesome and amazing. And not a single month goes by when the money gets debited and put into my bank account that I'm not wicked grateful for all of that. Awesome stuff. It's really cool. It's just, I can't express the coolness of it all. All right, so here's a little more about Darcy. His essays in journalism have appeared in Harper's Magazine and the New York Times Magazine. He's received numerous awards, including a National Magazine Award, a Livingston Award, and an award for public service from the Society for Professional Journalists. His work has been adapted for stage and screen and anthologized in the Best American Essays, Best American Science Writing, and the Library of America series. He teaches in the English department at Harvard. So in this conversation, we talk about how he landed on his central figures for The Last Shot, which included Stephon Marbury, who went on to have a damn good NBA career from 1996 to 2009, then played in China until 2018. Darcy also talks about how the obstacles he faced while reporting the book turned out to be the very crux of what the book centered around, and how he reports on, or does his reporting only using a notebook. No tape recorders, man, even while driving a car. Awesome talk, Seeing Efforts. Great talk. Here we go. Riff. It's great to be talking about something that's been 30 years since you wrote it, and a little more than 30 years since you conceived of it.
That's right. Yeah, and it's thrilling that it's been in print all these years, and and thrilling that it's out in an audiobook format. There was an audiobook right at the time the hardcover came out, but it was prior to Audible, Spotify, everything. It was on cassette tape.
Oh wow!
So it's nice that it lives in the internet now.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, it's I remember when it first came on my radar in the late aughts, as I had mentioned to you over email, that as I was doing kind of a shadow central figure in a subculture of sorts for MFA thing, and that's how we came to have a mutual acquaintance in the great Dick Todd, and he had brought up your book because it's similar, different themes, but a similar immersive ethos. That's when your book came on my radar, and that's a good jumping off point to talk about Dick Todd. How did you guys get connected for this?
So there was a wonderful magazine published out of Western Massachusetts, just outside of Northampton, called New England Monthly, that had a very successful but brief, I think, 6-year life. There were a bunch of magazines in that mold back then: Texas Monthly, New England Monthly, Washington Monthly, and Dick Todd was the executive editor. And I went there to work in my late 20s as a writer and an editor, and I got to know him then. And did some long form journalism for him and for the magazine. And then when the magazine folded, and this would have been, I think, 1990 or so, Dick went back to his full-time job as an editor at Houghton Mifflin. He had his own imprint at the time. And he basically just invited me to come to him with some ideas, which was, was a terrific opportunity. He's an incredible editor, and we were friends at that point as well. And so I used to go up. He was living in the Berkshires. I was living in New York City. I'd go up on the weekends, and we would just go hiking around the woods around his house and just sort of brainstorm book ideas. I'd done a bunch of reporting about inner city issues, and so that was something I was interested in. I wanted to write about kids, batted a bunch of ideas back and forth. Should I spend a year on one floor of a housing project? Should I find a playground and spend a year there? And then at some point, sort of seems like an obvious idea now, but at the time it was sort of like a eureka moment. Oh, wait a minute, what about an inner city basketball team? What about a season? What about a school year? I'd have a finite group of figures to follow. I'd have the arc of a season, and I'd have the other and even more dramatic arc of what happened to the kids as they were recruited or not recruited to Division I schools. So we came up with the idea kind of generically, and then my job was to really just go around the boroughs of New York City, meeting kids and high school coaches and high school principals, and find a place to actually set, the generic idea. I must have spent 2 or 3 weeks going around to different high schools. But when I got down to Lincoln High School in Coney Island, and I met the kids that I would ultimately write about, and the high school coach and the neighborhood itself, it was kind of very quickly decided, that this is the place to do it.
When you were having those conversations with Dick, when you eventually landed on this subject, what was his reaction when he was like, when you landed on this idea?
I think he was, as I recall, he was very excited. It seemed kind of perfect for what we had been, batting around. His caution to me, as I recall, was, that there were sort of two ways to go about it. One was to find a school with a very charismatic coach figure and make him sort of front and center. And the other way, which is the way that I ended up doing it, was to find the players that I thought were really interesting and would carry the book. In the case of Lincoln High School, the high school coach was terrific, but he wasn't going to carry a narrative, and that actually seemed kind of like a blessing, because it put me in the position of having to my relationship with the kids was going to have to work, and they were going to have to be front and center. And it also allowed me to avoid the sort of journalistic trope of positioning a book around a white authority figure, a kind of savior figure. And I felt like I had, read that before, seen it on film, and I wanted to avoid it. I wanted something where I could bring the reader as intimately into these kids' lives as possible. So the fact that the coach, wasn't that sort of larger than life charismatic figure, worked to the advantage of the book, but made it quite challenging and a bit of a risk at the start.
And what was the process by which, and the conversations by which, you had to curry favor and essentially audition a set of kids that were going to be you were going to have access to and carry the narrative for you?
So the day that I went to Coney Island, I drove around the neighborhood first. It was such a dramatically isolated neighborhood, really cut off not only from the rest of Brooklyn, but certainly from the rest of New York City. And basketball was just woven into the fabric of the neighborhood. I mean, you couldn't drive half a block without seeing a court and a bunch of players and so forth. So the neighborhood felt very interesting to me. Then I met the kids that I wrote about at a practice that I watched, and they were just amazing kids. They were friends with each other. They played off of each other in interesting ways. I was sitting on the bleachers and I was watching them practice. They were practicing their fast break, which was just a thing of beauty. And I just come from the neighborhood, and I felt like I heard the book that I wanted to write in my head, sort of in my ear. And I'd never had that experience before. And it was a kind of moment where I thought, well, this is where the book needs to take place. So to your question, though, about auditioning for them, so I was, of course, quite nervous to introduce myself and the project of the book. And I thought that I was going to be a somewhat exotic figure, a reporter who wanted to spend a year with them. What I didn't realize is that I wasn't at all exotic. They were being written up in the New York Post and the Daily News. They were so used to journalists and reportorial attention and so forth. They totally got it. They were like, oh yeah, we're great. We're the best players in New York City. We totally understand why you would want to spend a year with us. We're down with that. So, they didn't realize just how much time I was going to spend with them, although I tried to be pretty transparent about that. I said, I'm going to be coming every day. I'm going to spend a year with you. I'd like to watch you in class, at practice, at games, at your homes and that kind of thing. So I think the level of journalistic attention that I paid came as a surprise over the coming weeks. But the fact that I wanted to spend this year with them was something that they kind of understood right from the start, and were enthusiastic about.
How did you navigate the time that you spent with them collectively and individually?
That's a good question. So at some point, I think early on, basketball teams got 12 players. I thought, well, that I would, distribute my time, if not among the full 12, at least the starting 5. But at some point fairly early on, my interest, kind of narrowed to the 4 kids that I wrote about. Chaka Ship, Corey Johnson, the kid that I called Russell Thomas in the book, and Stefan Marbury. So at some point, early on, I realized, oh well, it doesn't really have to kind of democratically represent all the kids on the team, or even the starting five. That I could write about the kids that interested me the most. And then once I made that decision, I really just tried to keep up with the four of them as the school year went on. If one was going to a summer camp, I'd go with that kid, and then I'd fly back to New York, and I'd go to a summer camp with the next kid, and that kind of thing. But I had a feeling that the book was going to be kind of an ensemble piece. I really needed not to miss anything crucial in all four of these kids' lives.
And as you write and read in the newer introduction, the reporting journey was something you didn't anticipate coming. Like at first you said, like a moment ago, you said like, the book kind of was starting to like formulate itself in your head when you got to that court, but then you realize over the course of your reporting that it's not taking shape in the way you had anticipated. So maybe you can take us to that headspace.
Yeah. So, when I said that I was sitting in the bleachers that first day and I could hear the book, in my ear or in my imagination, I did hear a book, but it was not the book that I ultimately wrote. The book that I heard that day was kind of a optimistic book. It was written in the third person, kind of omniscient narrator who could move around, who drew no attention to himself. I thought that I was writing a book about, kids triumphing over their environment and their circumstances by dint of hard work on the court and in the classroom. And over the time that I spent with the kids, I realized, in fact, what was unfolding and what I ultimately had to write was 180 degrees turned from that. It was really about how environment and circumstances and a high school and college basketball system were conspiring to prevent these kids from actually doing what they dreamed of doing. So the mood of the book darkened, and crucially, I realized at some point that I could not leave myself out. Not because I thought that I was interesting to the reader, but that some of the reporting obstacles that I ran into and the ways in which the kids and some of their families responded to me was actually very illuminating about the circumstances that the kids were in. And so that was actually kind of a breakthrough, and Dick was instrumental in helping me figure out that I could not be an invisible, omniscient narrator. I had to be there in the flesh and on the page for, to sort of navigate the story for the reader.
Yeah, that's a great point to make, that sometimes you just want to be omniscient and lay it all out there and let the reader judge for themselves. But there comes a point where, and this is an editor I'm working with, has said that as the driver of the car, that being the writer, sometimes you do have to quite literally point to the passengers in the car or point out and say, like, this is important over here. You need to pay attention to this, and this is why. And I think that's essentially what your purpose was here. Like you're not present. You're not you don't overstay your welcome ever when the I pronoun comes out. So yeah, when you come in, it's like, okay, this has weight when Darcy kind of really enters the fray.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when I used to do long form magazine writing for the New York Times Magazine, where I was a contributing editor for a bunch of years, I had a rule for myself, which was that I would never enter into a story unless there was an absolute need for me to be there. But in this case, the story wouldn't have made sense if I hadn't been there. And there were so many moments when I was speaking one-on-one to one of the boys. And so just as a matter of logistics, how was I going to render that if I wasn't there? But so I had to be there as a kind of as a figure or a foil for the kids who are speaking to me, sometimes on their own and sometimes in a group as we were driving around in my car, and they would all be talking to me. But another reason why the first person narrator had to be in the book is, and this actually came from a conversation that I had with Dick. I was telling him about where my reporting was leading me, and he said, "Oh, I see. This is a narrative of revelation." That was his phrase. This is a story about someone understanding something, and that someone, sort of unavoidably is you. So the story moves chronologically. It follows the kids over there, three of them senior year, and Stefan when he was a freshman. It follows their recruiting. It moves forward in time, but the real motor of the narrative is, the first person narrator, myself, starting out thinking all those optimistic thoughts that I did have on the bleachers that first day, and how it transpired that 9 months later, I had a completely different view of the situation the kids were in.
Yeah, and you really evoke the real sleaziness of college recruiters and the head coaches there, who are still some very prominent names, some since long retired and some recently retired. But just the salesmanship and it's like selling cars, and the way they the bill of goods that they're selling, these kids who are, their talent is their lottery ticket, and the way they're pulling at that and then ripping it away sometimes it really was eye opening and revelatory for me as a reader, and I suspect for you too as the reporter.
Yeah. No, I remember sitting in the recruiting room, over multiple days while these pretty big name Big East coaches would come and sit down with the players. And at first I thought, God, aren't they aware that there's a report? I mean, had a notebook in front of me. I was moving my hand over the notebook constantly. They knew that I was taking down everything that was being said. And I thought, it's really interesting that they're not more guarded around me. And then at some point I realized, no, this is business as usual. And they've been doing it for so many years. And there's nothing striking to them about the way that they're speaking to the kids. So, but, for those of us who have never been in that recruiting room, to hear what gets said is really incredible. And the level of, emotional manipulation is it's really striking and pretty disturbing.
Yeah, like when they're, eventually when it comes down to the moment where maybe their pen is coming out, and be like, and they might be a little bit hesitant, be like, well, you know what, there is another power forward we're looking at, and if you don't sign here, we're going to look at him, and we don't know if the scholarship's still going to be there or not. And you get that, and they're laying it at the feet of these 17, 18-year-old kids, and it's just like, oh my God, like I don't in that pressure cooker situation, I don't know what I would do. It's just, as an adult, let alone like a kid with with this ability and this dream of getting out of Coney Island.
Yeah, when you think about that, and the thing that I think disturbed me the most was that they did research on these kids' home lives. So one kid, his father had died a number of years before he was a senior in high school, and they played on that. There was another kid who had an embarrassing moment with, he had some mental health issues, and they knew about that, and they played on that as well. They talked about, how if you come out to UCal Irvine, you can start afresh. Your past is gone. You're on the West Coast. Whatever happened in Brooklyn stays in Brooklyn, stuff like that. Is very alluring to the kids, but again, really, really disturbing to watch.
And when you're, spending just hours upon hours with just in and around the neighborhoods with the kids and gyms and classrooms. What's your primary means of documenting all the information, be it, in classrooms and meetings or even in the car as you're driving them around to try to document everything?
Yeah, it's funny. My car, a little Toyota hatchback, was like the confession booth. So we would just drive around endlessly. Partly, I would drive them to games and practices, and sometimes they would just want to go for a lift or go over to another neighborhood where one of the players' brothers had a barber shop and so forth. But something about happens with kids of all ages. You get in the car and it's moving, and you just start talking. Everybody starts talking. So it's just a wonderful kind of reporting tool. Everybody would be just relaxed and talking. So that happened. But of course, there's a hitch there, which is how do you record it all? Early on when I started doing narrative journalism, I made a decision not to use a tape recorder. You do get the accuracy of a verbatim recording if you use a handheld tape recorder, but you have to transcribe everything, so it doubles your research time. Every hour in the field is another hour or more that you have to spend listening to it. But more importantly, when I did use a tape recorder, I listened less acutely than I did when I was simply taking notes. Because if you're taking notes and you don't get it down because you're not listening, you're not paying sufficient attention, it's gone forever. You have no backup. And that was useful to me. And, sort of paradoxically, though I was bent over my notebook all the time, because I was listening so carefully, I actually interacted with the kids more naturally, and certainly with more attention to what they were saying. But when we were in the car, it was a little crazy. I had a steno pad that I kept on my knee, and then when I'd hit a red light, I would just write as fast as I could whatever it was that we'd said in the intervening 4 or 5 blocks, and then I put it down, put the car in gear, and move forward. But then as soon as I got out of the car, I would look back over those notes. I would see all the phrases that I'd quickly written down, and I just fill it out, with the dialogue. But so that was my sort of my MO. It's always most important to get what people say down first. That's sort of the first level of reporting. But I knew that, when I was going to be writing the book, however many months later, I was going to need much more than just what was said. I was going to need gesture and mood and what the weather was like and how hot was it, what were the facial expressions and things like that. So first line of reporting always went to getting down as accurately as I could what was said. And then as soon as I got that down, I would fill in the margins with absolutely every detail that I could kind of vacuum up and get into my notebooks, knowing that, a month's down the road when I was trying to recreate these moments in, sort of dramatized scenes, I was going to need dialogue, but I was going to need a lot more to make it seem, alive to the reader.
Would it be one of those deals like at the end of the day you would go and like kind of clean up your notebooks and try to spackle in the holes of what was legible versus illegible, and then you're just making sure that come time to access this stuff, you're like, oh man, I have no idea what I wrote down here.
Yes, exactly. So as soon as my reporting was done, I would go home, and I would never permit myself to do anything, make dinner, nothing until I had sat down with the notebooks and I reread what I had just written for that reason, so that I wouldn't look at it 3 months later and have no idea. So I would go through, I'd spackle in the holes, as you said, and then I would put in all that sort of remembered detail about what was going on. If we were walking down the street, what did it feel like? What did the neighborhood feel like? Stuff like that. I did a piece, actually the first reporting piece that I did for Dick at New England Monthly. I attended an event and it went very late at night, and I went to sleep, and the next morning I tried to, download my my short-term memory of what had happened, and half of it was gone. And then I realized you can never permit yourself to sleep until you purge your mind of all of those details, get them into a notebook, and then you can make dinner, take a shower, go to sleep. But you got to get it done first.
I love that. And I think something that you do just impeccably well is your game descriptions and stuff of that nature. Them in action on the court, and like anything in sports, those need to be deployed very judiciously. Otherwise, it gets repetitive and they lose their heft. And the way you describe it is so evocative and immersive. And just maybe take us to the writing and even the selection of what you choose to write about. So each of those times that we see them on the court interacting and playing, dominating, performing, that anytime that you deploy that, we feel it and it feels fresh and vibrant.
Yeah. So the one time that I did allow myself to use a tape recorder was when I was watching games, because I knew that if I was looking down on a notebook, basketball's such a blazing fast game, I would miss something crucial. So at that point, I would stand usually next to the coach, next to the player bench with a handheld tape recorder, and I would dictate play-by-plays into the tape recorder, so that I could just never take my eyes off the action. And then I had that, which was, incredibly valuable in terms of, recreating moments that would go by. It's interesting. One of the things I'm now remembering that I worried about going into the project was, how do I write about basketball? I did the reporting for the book in 1991. Since then, there have been a lot of great books on basketball, but at that time, there were surprisingly few. Baseball was considered, sort of the sport that, literary writers wanted to write about. It has the advantage of being a much slower moving game, and so it can be recreated more easily. And I thought, how is this going to happen with a game as fast as basketball? But the tape recorder helped. And then I realized that actually what you can do is you just, as you say, you have to be judicious about the moments that you describe, but chalk a ship who is their center running down the court and dunking the ball, which might take 4 seconds in real time, could actually be stretched out on the page so that it takes maybe a minute to actually read, but that there's something beautiful about taking something really fast and slowing it down and elongating the moment. So I had a lot of fun doing that. But also, as you say, I was always mindful of the problem of repetition. Like, how many different ways can you say, he hit a 3-pointer and hit nothing but net? Well, first of all, nothing but net is a cliche that, is used all the time. So how can you say it without using that phrase? But then even if you've come up with a more, fresh way of saying it, how can you come up with 4 or 5 fresh ways of saying it so that each time, the player hits a perfect 3 over the course of the book, you've said it to the reader in a different way. So it was challenging, but it was also a lot of fun to try to invent those metaphors.
Well, and there's one moment in the Empire State Games as well where Russell is on the line he could win the game with 2 free throws, and that moment you talk about dragging or extending that moment. I mean, that takes, and when I was listening to it, I mean, we're talking several minutes, and he's at the line, and you're filling in all kinds of details and just stretching that moment out for a long time, and it's amazing, and it builds tension because you're like, there are moments where he had come up big, but then the other times when if there was too much time to think, he'd get in his own head, and maybe he wasn't going to rise to that moment. So you're thinking the whole time, you're like, oh my God, but is he going to hit these free throws? It's an incredible way to create tension too.
Yeah, that's I think that's the 3rd chapter in the book. It was the hardest chapter to write, but now it's kind of my favorite chapter. Well, because he's such an appealing kid, but I realized at some point, well, the piece can begin with, or the chapter can begin with him on the line, about to attempt these free throws. And then I thought, but what does the reader need to know before the ball goes through the hoop? Such that when they do read that he makes the free throws, it means what it should mean to them. And what I realized that an entire chapter, they needed to read an entire chapter about this kid, so that I really needed to just set up the situation that the game was on the line. He was at the foul line. He had 2 free throws and a ton of pressure on him. And then I could depart for 25 or 30 pages and tell the reader, show the reader what this kid was like, so that when we come back to that same moment at the end of the chapter and he makes the free throws, hopefully the reader rejoices because they know him so much better at the end of the chapter.
Russell, as you call him in the book, but all of them, especially the 3 seniors, they're just so, just the way they think and process and metabolize what's going on around them and how they view the world, and Corey too. I was just amazed at how, not amazed might be the wrong word, but I loved how just brilliant and thoughtful they were, and the intentionality through which they go through a day, and their, the dreams and the goals and the way they're articulating, what's going on in their lives. I was like, these kids are brilliant. I not that I thought otherwise, but I was just like, wow, Darcy landed on some amazing kids to report on.
Yeah, and their inner lives. It's a terrible phrase, but it's kind of true. Like, that's what the reader wants to know. Is like, who are they in the deep recesses of their personality? As you say, they metabolized or processed the world, their experience, those months very deeply and very differently, each from the other. So it was fascinating, but also a challenge. Like, in a book that has to be fact-based, the data is drawn from facts, observation, quotations, and so forth. Like, how deeply can you take the reader into the inner lives of kids without any invention at all on the part of the narrator or the author? So that was something that I set for myself, to try to get their psychologies onto the page as best as I could.
And circling back a little bit to just the decision to always use notebook and your own handwriting and shorthand on longhand or whatever. Over the course of your reporting, be it for this book or other longer stories, had there ever been a moment where you're like, oh man, I kind of wish I had a tape recorder to capture all this, the dialects and certain intonations that are sometimes hard to catch in the moment where you're scribbling?
I did a story for the Times Magazine about British Petroleum, BP, and I ended up having to fly out to like an oil rig in the North Sea, and I met with with the CEO of BP at the time, but also some scientists, and there's so many acronyms and scientific jargon. And I was doing my thing with the notebook, and I only had a brief time with them. And afterwards, I really wished that I had a tape recorder, so that I could, listen back and, parse the language, and maybe even play it to people with more expertise than I had to actually, translate it. But I find that the notebook's such an interesting tool. So I did a piece for the Times Magazine years ago about the brief life and death of a premature baby. And the baby was born at 23 and a half weeks gestation out of, the usual 40. He was born with so many compromises, and he had to be resuscitated in the delivery room by a set of doctors and nurses and respiratory therapists, and it happened in the middle of the night, and I was there. I didn't have my tape recorder, again, because I always engage better without it. they said, you can come, you can watch the delivery, just put your back to the wall and don't get in the way of anything. And so that's what I did. And I did the thing where it was quite controversial too, as to, how aggressively were they going to try to resuscitate this baby, and what medical machinery and tools were they willing to use. And so I just kept my back to the wall. I leaned over my notebook, and I wrote down everything that I heard said about the decisions that were being made in the moment. But then when I came back up into the neonatal intensive care unit where the baby was brought after his birth, I went to all the principals during the delivery and resuscitation. I said, okay, that happened over the course of like 8 minutes. Tell me your version of what happened. And it was interesting. I had 8 or 10 versions. So I had my own version of everything that I had heard and I could write down, but then I had 8 or 10 other versions. And then in recreating that moment, it's a big scene in the piece. I could draw on all of those accounts to recreate it as accurately as possible. So,
and as you write in the new introduction to Last Shot, you as you're kind of winding down your reporting anyway, a lot of things were a lot of insurmountable roadblocks were starting to be thrown in front of you, be it coaches started icing you out. Even Russell's mother just didn't want him distracted anymore. The NCAA and Stephon Marbury's father is coming in like wanting some compensation for the time that you're spending with them, them thinking that you're going to reap major rewards for this off of their back. So just kind of take us to those moments of, what's happening to you as kind of the ground feels like it might be falling out from under you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good summary of all the things that were happening. Russell's mother decided that, it was too important what her son was trying to do to be distracted by having a reporter there. Stephon's father wanted payment for including Stephon in the book. The NCAA had essentially banned me from recruiting sessions, and I was having trouble with the high school coach as well. So I was really I was losing access to the story. The ground was falling away. I wish I could say that I was alert enough to realize what was happening. All I registered at the time was these are too many obstacles. And so I started my reporting in May of their kids' junior year, and I was planning to go a full 12 months until they graduated at the end of their senior year. I got about 9 months in, and so this would be like December or so of their senior year, and I ran into so many obstacles that I in fact stopped attending. I stopped going to Lincoln every day as I had been doing, not because I thought that my reporting was done, but because I thought the book wasn't going to work. I thought there was no way at that point to complete the book that I wanted to complete. I thought I had no ending. I had lost access and so forth, and so I stopped going. And it was a crushing moment. And it was only over the course of several months and many conversations with very helpful editors, Dick Todd chiefly, but others as well, that I realized that these obstacles that I was facing were interesting. And if I changed my angle of vision on them, I could see them not as the death of the book that I wanted to write, but as actually the most important things that were happening in the book. And that in fact, these obstacles, as I said earlier, were actually very illuminating as to the situation these kids were in. The suspicion of outsiders coming to Coney Island, the need for money, the hypocrisy of the NCAA, all of those things were getting played out in what was happening to me. And, and if there was a way to write about that, again, not to not to write about, the problems that a reporter was having trying to write his book, but what did this say about the situation these kids were in? And once I realized that, and then I realized, oh yeah, this has got to be written in the first person and so forth. Then I realized, no, the book's not dead. Actually, the book is very much alive. It's just a totally different book than I thought I was gonna have to write.
Well, when you say at that moment, say December 91, and you wish you were more alert to something, is that exactly what you're referring to? It's just like, oh, this, what's kind of happening to me in terms of this is it's emblematic of what's happening to them. And did you lose a lot of time in that just in your own head as you write, being bewildered and depressed? Do you feel like you lost a lot of time, just thinking in that terms, and then the light bulb went on?
Yeah. A full year went by. So I stopped in December of 91. I had some former colleagues at Harper's Magazine, where I had been an editor, and they were interested in running a magazine story about my experience. And I wrote a third person account of stuff, and they kept saying to me, it's not quite working in the third person. You keep saying you got kicked out of Coney Island. That was my sort of shorthand phrase for what had happened to me. I said, tell us more about that. And I talked about that more, and they said, put that in, write about that, put that in. And, so I ended up writing a long piece about the players for Harper's Magazine, and the process of writing that piece and simultaneously talking to Dick about it eventually made the light bulb go off. But it didn't go off. It took a year, close to a year, for me to realize, oh, this is interesting. And there's just a different way that I have to look at it. So yes, I wasted a lot of time went by in a state of bewilderment and depression. But it's something that I try to carry forward with me, which is that the obstacles that you encounter to the thing that you, whether it's a book or a magazine article, an essay, to try to take a breath and see what those obstacles might be teaching you. And are they shaking up your preconceived notions of your project in a useful way?
When Stephon Marbury's father wants money for his kids' participation, and just in not wanting to feel wholly exploited by white reporter coming in and potentially benefiting off of following his kid around. On the one hand, it's like it goes against journalistic ethics to pay for that kind of thing, but you can almost see his point. And I just, it's a really thorny ethical question, and I just wonder, just like how did it get you thinking more about that degree of transaction between source and reporter?
Yeah, it's really ethically very complicated. Checkbook journalism, I guess is the phrase. Is frowned upon.
Yep.
And in certain situations, if you're a reporter for a daily newspaper, and I completely understand why that's a line that you can't cross. When you become so involved in people's lives, as I was with the project, it's a different situation. And in fact, I began to think my way through this problem and came to the conclusion that, in fact, I really ought to figure out some sort of way to compensate the players at the time. And this is just insane. Looking back on it, the NCAA said that would violate their amateur status. And so render them ineligible for the very thing that they were working so hard to get, which was the scholarship to a 4-year Division I school. So now, 30 years later, everything is changing, with the NCAA and name, image, likeness, compensation, and so forth. But at the time, the NCAA was incredibly rigid and doctrinaire about that.
Yeah, and so at the 20-year anniversary, Amos Barshaw did a really good feature on it for Grantland. And, when he reached out to Stefan Marbury, he only had he had a pretty terse statement. He just said the book is false. He, meaning you, did it to make money off of young black kids in the hood. That's all I have to say about it. And like, when you hear that, like, what goes through your mind when you realize he's interpreted it in that way?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredibly painful. So not my intention then or now. I think that I understand why it was a really hard book for some people who were depicted in the book and also in the Coney Island community to read. It basically said that this whole process that so many kids for a number of generations have been trying to do and turn to their advantage wasn't working. And I thought it was pretty clear that I, as a reporter and an author, were not calling these kids losers. I was saying they were in a situation that was conspiring to make them lose. But I understand why, if you were in that situation, you could read the book and think, he's calling us all a bunch of losers. Our older brother's a bunch of losers, our parents, that kind of thing. So I understand where Stefan was coming from in saying that.
As I was listening to the book too, and having read Isabel Wilkerson's cast, those two, I think they're just it's a really good harmonious pairing to get a sense of the institutional racism and the institutions that are meant, like you said, conspiring to make kids like these lose and keep them in their caste. And when you read the two together, you see, you start to see how the gears are working to keep a cast of people in their place, and it's revelatory and very dispiriting.
The phrase systemic racism or institutionalized racism is a pretty common phrase now. Back in 91, it wasn't.
Right.
But I think that, I think that without having heard that phrase, I was groping in a dark room, metaphorically, and I was pressing up against all the very elements of the system that were closing in on these kids, whether it was the NCAA or the individual college coaches or the educations that they've had, starting in, kindergarten all the way up to high school, where suddenly they had to take standardized tests, their neighborhood, their family structures, all of those things, in a way, it had been kind of useful to me to have heard that phrase back then. But I think that I was sensing it, and part of the mission of the book, when it came back together again after that year, was to try to evoke and describe the elements of the system as best as I could.
Yeah, I have a family member who categorically does not, buy into the idea of that certain people have more privilege than others, and it's very hard for me to understand. I think of the SAT conundrum that the kids were under in your book and generations before and after, of of taking the test is not a sign of intelligence. It's a sign of how well you take that test. And
that's right.
And people with more privilege can afford the $600 or $1,000 it is to take a course to get really good at taking that test. A lot of people, that prices a lot of people out. As a result, even if you just need to get a 700 to qualify for a Division I school, it's prohibitive for a lot of people. And that little bit of gatekeeping that is the mark of privilege. And I just of those who have and have not. And it just you saw it on display very, very evocatively in your book.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the standardized test, prep classes that, that kids of more means can take. But then there's also, what kind of education have you had such that by the time you're a sophomore, junior, senior in high school, you're actually able to, do reasonably well. And then on top of that, if you think about, this one narrow path that these kids have, which is to get to a decent Division I school based, in part on grades, but also because of their basketball prowess. But then there's this threshold on the SAT that they absolutely have to pass. If you think about the pressure that puts on that kid in that room that day that he has to take it, it's a completely different academic experience than a kid whose ability to go to college doesn't rest so crucially on that.
Yeah, because it's not just the pressure on them individually. They're feeling it for their families and also the the entirety of Coney Island, who just they need to, if there was a kid of this nature who's like they have the chance to get out, they're one of the good, they're one of the good ones that might be able to do this, and you leverage their talent. And when they fall short, the totality of that pressure, it's not just on them, it's just they're feeling it from all angles, which is just compounds the tragedy.
Yeah, that's right. And that's why it was so revelatory. And so Russell Thomas, who struggled so much with the SATs, and he was the kid I was thinking about when I was just saying that about the amount of pressure on a given day when he had to take the test. But, for a year before then, he carried around a bunch of index cards that were his study aids, so that he could brush up on vocabulary, when he's sitting on the subway riding from one game to another, that kind of thing.
I did abysmally on my SATs. I think I took them 4 times. My best was a 1080, but I was like a 3.7 GPA kid. I was in everything else. So on pace that I was never in a position like them. I'm not complaining, but it's like I needed to get to 1200 because I was going to be the shortstop at an Ivy League school, but I needed to get to 12, and I just couldn't for the life of me get there. And I would be there, I would feel the pressure, I'd get all pissed off. I'm like, this is the thing that is determining where I'm going or where I'm not going to go. And I got that 1080 the first time, and then it was 1050, 1050, 1050, and I was just like, holy shit, I was like, I'm a fucking idiot. And it's just like, I was never told how to take the test. And meanwhile, likewise, the kids in your story, they get decent grades. Like, they're intelligent kids, but the SAT is its own thing. And no one knows that sometimes you got to leave things blank. Unless someone tells you that, you're never going to leave anything blank.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And, it was also, it was frightening how fast word of these kids' test scores would travel. So, everybody in Coney Island would know. Did he make it? No, he didn't make it this time. So imagine, you come back from school and everybody already knows how you did. And, in the case of Stefan, he had older brothers who struggled with the test. And so there's that additional sort of family and generational pressure on him. As well. And then, for reasons that I could never figure out, the college coaches sometimes knew before, how the kids had scored. I don't know how that information leaked to them. But if they knew that the kid was still struggling, then, they would withdraw their attention and move on to another kid.
What did this book, do to you? Did it, it's your only book. It's a brilliant book. And, there's and it's your only book. And I wonder if this book in some way, I don't know, not broke you, but you're like, you know what, I'm one and done, and this is it. That, I don't know, just take me to that headspace.
No, nothing really like that. After I finished the book, it opened up a wonderful opportunity for me to become a contributing writer at the Times Sunday magazine.
Nice.
And that was a position that I held on and off for, 15 years or so. So I did a bunch of long form journalism for them. which would have happened if I hadn't written the book. And then about 15 years ago or so, I left New York. I came up to Cambridge. I got a full-time teaching job, and so I'm teaching and being the kind of immersive reporting that I did when I was younger, and I wasn't teaching and so forth is not really, doesn't make a lot of sense. So I'm these days I'm writing essay and memoir.
Oh, nice.
So I've just turned sort of in a new nonfiction direction, and that just works better with teaching and family life and that kind of thing.
What do you find is the challenge of teaching another wave of journalists when your toolbox from the 80s and 90s is some of the certain skills translate, but other things don't. So what is the challenge for you to teach to a new generation of journalists?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, mostly these days I'm actually teaching what I'm writing myself, which is personal essay and memoir. Although I do a bit of teaching of journalism, and we'll be doing it in the coming year. I think that the access that I got as a reporter in Coney Island, that I got when I was doing that piece that I was talking about the premature baby at a neonatal intensive care unit. I did another long piece about a group of air traffic controllers at a radar facility that controlled the airspace over Kennedy, LaGuardia, and Newark. It's very hard to take that experience and help students in similar projects, because there's so much more anxiety. I mean, each of those stories, there's anxiety about journalists and reporters, and so the access is something that's much harder to come by. Like, well, part of it's like, the piece about air traffic controllers was done pre 9/11. Post 9/11, that's not going to happen. The story about the baby in the intensive care unit, I had incredible access, but there's just so much anxiety about medical malpractice and that kind of thing. It's hard to, show those pieces to students and help them find their way, into situations that they want to write about. But it's still wonderful work to be doing, that kind of, fly on the wall journalism. So I keep at it. Just this past spring, I had a student who was writing about artificial wombs, which was something that the doctors in the neonatal intensive care unit that I wrote about 25 years ago joked was going to be the wave of the future. And here it is. And now I have a student writing about it. She managed incredible access among doctors and patients and so forth. So it still happens. But I guess, to answer your question, I think it's about access.
Mm-hmm. Very nice. Well, Darcy, I love bringing these conversations down for a landing by just asking you, the guest, for a recommendation for the listeners out there. And it's just like anything you're excited about that's bringing you some joy in your life. So,
oh, wow.
Yeah, so I'll just kind of extend that to you. What might you recommend for the listeners?
Oh, my God. It's funny you did warn me that you're going to ask this, but I didn't think about it. But now I am. The great short story writer Alice Munro, Canadian short story writer, died a couple of weeks ago.
Okay, I will say we recorded this interview several weeks before there were the revelations that Alice Munro's youngest daughter was sexually abused by her stepfather, and Munro subsequently stayed with her husband, her daughter's stepfather, throughout the ordeal after she knew of said abuse. And so I don't know what to make of that. I don't know what your relationship is to Alice Munro or to any maligned artist after such revelations come to pass. But I just wanted to bring that up because that is now the elephant in the room, I guess, if you bring up Alice Munro. And this was well before that report came out. Okay, back to Darcy.
And I've been rereading her stories. And it's fiction, but it's, yeah, actually, Dick was one of the first editors to tell me, while writing nonfiction, always be reading fiction. The story power, the storytelling power of fiction writers, short story writers or novelists is, such a good thing to be reading while you're writing nonfiction. So it's that in her stories that is useful to me, but also her willingness to always look for the messiest emotions and the most complex situations and never to reduce those situations. I find that thrilling to read, and it's super helpful to me as a writer as well.
Well, speaking of thrilling, this was thrilling to speak with you, Darcy, about The Last Shot and just the kind of the ins and outs and the nuts and bolts of it. So I just thank you so much for carving out the time to do this. This was wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. It was really fun to talk to you about it.
All right. Awesome. Thanks to Darcy, and thanks to you, CNFers, for hanging around with me in the pod. If you dig it, subscribe, download, share with a friend. Doesn't cost you anything. Maybe consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or a rating on Spotify. All of those help validate the enterprise for the wayward CNFer looking for some nonfiction conversation to put a little juice in the tank. Because don't we all need the juice? Crave the juice. Getting to the end, CNFers. Getting to the end. I finished a very late stage round of edits from my big book editor, and I'm combing through the edits from my very astute wife, who aspirationally wishes she could do developmental editing instead of, what she does now. She really just has an eye for it and really likes it. She's given me tremendous insights so far. I've written a blog post that handing your spouse your work in progress is cruel and unusual punishment, and that it can lead to marital discord. Either that your spouse or you in your relationship might not be critical enough, which sucks for the work. The work suffers when it doesn't get to the right editorial eye. Or perhaps they're too critical, and then you don't talk for several days unless the pipes burst in the house. I held off giving her a draft until it was very nearly complete, like very late in the process. So 3 very skilled sets of eyes have read this book. Glenn, of course, poor guy, he got the worst of it. I feel like I just need to just keep sending money to Glenn, like in perpetuity, just here. Just reparations, morally. I'm sorry. That's my acknowledgement section for the book when I write it. It's not going to say acknowledgements. It's just going to say with apologies. Matt, he got the second worst of it, and his comments are just like, when you read a fortune cookie and it's just like blah 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 in bed. I feel like his comments have the tinge like it's just like blah 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 blah. You fucking moron. Blah, 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 blah. You're a fucking moron. That's untrue. I know he doesn't mean that, but I feel like he wishes I were smarter. I do too. And Melanie, she gets the third worst of it. Thing is, her goal is to focus on transitions and cohesion and to make sure the chapters are doing the work. I had to cut a scene the other day that I loved. Oh, man, I really loved it because it was so weird, like in the best possible way. Like you had never heard of this thing that happened. It was just so funny and quirky and, like I said, weird, just like super weird. So, okay, there was this race, I think it was back in early 1972, an indoor race down in L.A., and this gives you a sense of how popular track and field was back in the day. I'm going off script here, by the way. And the LA Times, they hired their track writer to make a prediction, not hired, but had their track writer make a prediction, and they pulled in an astrologer to make a prediction for the race, for the mile and the 2 miles. Yeah, Pre was running the 2 mile and the mile, it doesn't matter. And so they had like a point counterpoint thing with the expert and the astrologer. And the LA Times obviously carried it and had this wildly detailed thing about star charts and everything. And then Sports Illustrated was there too, covering the race. And it's just so wild that editorial footprints were dedicated to such a thing for like a non-Olympic thing. It was just the LA Times indoor in 1972. It was an Olympic year, of course, but it was just so weird. And the whole thing was highlighted. Matt's like, I don't know what this is adding. And he's right, but it's also sad. And word real estate is at a premium. And I think right now, I've got it down to about 109, 110,000 words, down from the first draft. Sorry, Glenn. Of 160,000 words, and working drafts that were hovering around 120. And it's just one of the many gems that needs to go because it doesn't wholly inform the arc of this biography, unless it was framed in a certain way to make it relevant. But I don't think, with words being such a premium at this point, I don't think it can make it. It's just a good talking point, I suppose. Make no mistake, biography is about selection. You know, what are the moments in the life of a person that feed a point of view? Mine being, I think, you think I know at this point, but I think, how Steve Prefontaine is the last amateur and the dawn of a paradigmatic modern athlete. Anything else that doesn't serve that forward propulsion has to get shaken out of the tree. And that's what's happening now in the 6,000th read through of this goddamn book. What you're doing is shaking out the tree for dead leaves. Addition by subtraction. Cool things are falling off the tree, man. Real snappy sentences falling to the floor. Composting at the roots. And when it sounds like writing, your writing is off. The best compliment I got from Melanie is when she tells me she forgets about the writing. That means the writing's on point. That brings up a whole other can of worms about style and voice. Like, you know, when you're watching a Wes Anderson movie or reading a David Foster Wallace essay or Hanif Abdurraqib essay, the ego side of any writer is like, I want to be distinct and I want people to buckle up, strap in, and you must be this tall to read this essay. In any case, next week might be kind of the last time I send this book off. And we're getting down to it. What are we, 9.5 months away from publication? Holy shit. I know I've been priming the pump on pre-orders, but it's not available yet. I'm just getting that idea, like Inception. I'm planting it in your brain over and over again. And then that way, when it happens, it'll happen. I don't want to just drop this hand grenade in your lap and then be like, crap. I just went out and bought a case of beer, and I can't afford a pre-order it right now. That's what kind of sucks about pre-ordering is, like, you got to buy the thing, and then you don't get the satisfaction of it coming in for, like, months away. That's kind of its appeal and its detraction, I guess. You almost forget that you bought the thing, and then eventually it comes in the mail. Like, oh, shit, look at that. Look at this thing I bought a while ago. That deferred gratification. We're just not a deferred gratification kind of culture. So to say, I'm going to spend $35 right now, and I'm not going to get anything for 4 months. Some people have asked for the link, but as I say in the newsletter right now, it's just not there yet. I just want you driving by that billboard, getting ready for it. So stay wild, CNFers, and if you can't do, interview. See ya.